You didn't realize how much noise you were living in until you finally stepped away. For so long, your reality was filtered through confusion, guilt, and emotional chaos. You doubted your instincts, overanalyzed every word, and walked on eggshells just to keep the peace. But once you truly detached from the narcissist, emotionally, mentally, and physically, something shifted. It wasn't instant relief, it was clarity, and that clarity hit hard. Suddenly, all the gaslighting, manipulation, and emotional exhaustion made sense. You weren't crazy, you were surviving. This video is for the version of you who's standing on the other side of that storm, beginning to see the truth for what it is. Let's walk through what happens when you finally detach and everything becomes unmistakably clear. You finally see that their love was conditional, based on control, not care. At first, you thought their love was just intense, maybe even passionate. They said the right things, gave just enough affection, and made you feel chosen, but only when you were doing exactly what they wanted. Now, with space between you, you see it clearly. It wasn't love. It was control dressed up as affection. Every kind gesture had strings attached. Every I love you came with an expectation, a rule, a warning. Their approval was a reward for your compliance, and their silence, or rage, was the punishment when you didn't obey. What you mistook for care was actually surveillance. What felt like attention was manipulation. You were being shaped, managed, controlled, not loved. Real love doesn't keep you walking on eggshells. It doesn't weaponize affection or turn vulnerability into ammunition. And when you finally step out of that fog, it hits hard. They never loved you for who you were, only for how well you played the part. You realize how much of yourself you silenced just to keep them calm. Looking back, you start to recognize how often you swallowed your truth just to avoid conflict. You tiptoed around their moods, softened your words, and censored your emotions. Not because you were wrong, but because you were afraid of how they'd react. You learned to downplay your needs, hide your disappointment, and pretend everything was fine just to keep the peace. Over time, their comfort became more important than your voice. You became smaller, quieter, easier, not for balance, but for survival. And now, with distance, you see, that wasn't compromise, it was self-abandonment. You weren't just trying to make things work, you were trying not to set them off. And in the process, you lost parts of yourself. Your opinions, your instincts, your emotional truth, all buried under the pressure to keep them calm. Healing begins the moment you stop apologizing for your voice and start reclaiming everything you muted to keep the relationship from exploding. You recognize that their apologies were strategies, not accountability. At the time, their apologies felt like relief, like maybe they finally understood the pain they caused. But now, with space and clarity, you see it differently. Their "I'm sorry" was never followed by change. It was a reset button. A tool to stop you from leaving, not an effort to make things right. They used remorse as a tactic, not a truth. And you, because you loved them, wanted to believe it. You wanted to believe that the tears were real, that the promises mattered. But every apology was just enough to make you stay, never enough to heal what they broke. Real accountability feels different. It doesn't manipulate your hope. It doesn't come with guilt trips or conditions. Now you understand. What they called sorry was just a strategy to keep control, and you're done confusing temporary guilt with genuine growth. You begin to understand that the confusion was intentional, not a miscommunication. At first, you blamed yourself. You thought maybe you misunderstood, overreacted, or read too much into things. You questioned your own memory, your emotions, your instincts. But with distance, the fog begins to lift, and you see the pattern clearly. The confusion wasn't accidental, it was created on purpose. They changed the story, denied the obvious, flipped blame, and left you constantly second-guessing yourself. It wasn't miscommunication, it was manipulation. A deliberate strategy to keep you unstable and easier to control. They knew that if you were busy questioning your reality, you wouldn't have the strength to question their behavior. And now that you've stepped away, you realize that the chaos wasn't yours to carry. You're not crazy. You were being emotionally disoriented by someone who needed confusion to maintain power, and now that you've named it, they can't use it anymore. You notice how emotionally exhausted you were from trying to be enough. You didn't notice it fully while you were in it, But now that you've stepped away, the exhaustion hits you like a wave. You were constantly adjusting, shrinking, explaining, pleasing, all to avoid their disapproval. You worked so hard to be enough, calm enough, loving enough, patient enough, strong enough, but the goalposts always moved. No matter how much you gave, it was never truly safe. That kind of emotional labor drains your spirit quietly, until you forget what it feels like to just be without effort. Now, in the silence, you feel how tired you really are, not because you were weak, but because you were giving all your strength to a dynamic built on imbalance. And seeing it clearly now, that's not just painful, it's freeing, because you finally understand that it wasn't about your worth, it was about their need to keep you doubting it. You stop blaming yourself for the chaos they created. At some point, the fog starts to clear, and with it comes one of the hardest truths. It was never your fault. You spent so long blaming yourself for the fights, the confusion, the coldness. You told yourself you were too sensitive, too emotional, too much. But now, with space between you and them, you see the pattern. You see how they stirred chaos and then stepped back like they weren't the ones who lit the fire. You realize they made you question your reactions so they could avoid responsibility. And finally, you stop apologizing for the things they did. You stop carrying guilt that was never yours to hold. That's when the real healing begins, when you stop trying to fix what they broke and start reclaiming the peace they convinced you didn't belong to you. You feel both grief and relief, mourning the fantasy, not the reality. That duality hits harder than you expected, the grief mixed with relief. You're not mourning them, not really. You're mourning the version of them you held onto in your mind, the hope, the potential, the story you told yourself to survive the chaos. You thought if you just loved harder, they'd finally show up for you. But now you see it was never about effort. It was about control. And once the illusion breaks, what's left isn't just pain, it's freedom. You feel lighter, but also empty. That's normal. You're letting go of a fantasy you built around someone who never truly existed the way you needed them to. It hurts, but it also heals. Because now, for the first time in a long time, you're making room for something real, starting with yourself. You start to rebuild your self-trust, piece by piece. After all the gaslighting, blame shifting, and emotional manipulation, your sense of reality took a hit. You stopped trusting your feelings, you doubted your memory, you second-guessed your needs. But now that you've detached, something shifts, slowly, quietly. You start to recognize your own voice again. It's shaky at first, like a whisper you haven't heard in a while, but it's yours. You begin to trust that gut feeling you used to ignore. You begin to trust that gut feeling you used to ignore. You check in with yourself instead of checking their reaction. You validate your own pain without needing anyone else to confirm it. And with every small boundary you hold, with every time you choose peace over old chaos, your self-trust grows stronger. This part of the journey isn't loud or dramatic. It's steady, it's healing, and it's yours. Piece by piece, you're coming back to yourself. You realize healing begins the moment you choose peace over explanation. That's when everything truly shifts. You stop trying to explain your pain to people who never really cared to understand it. You stop handing over your story to be debated, dismissed, or minimized. Instead, you start protecting it. You realize you don't owe anyone an explanation for why you left, why you're silent, or why you're finally prioritizing yourself. That moment, when you choose peace over proving your point, is the beginning of your real healing. It's when you finally reclaim your energy from all the battles that were never meant to be yours in the first place. You don't need to be understood by the person who hurt you. You need to be at peace with yourself. And that shift, that quiet choice to stop justifying and start healing, is where your power returns. That's when you begin to feel free. If this feels like your story, if you've lived through this kind of silent war and are just now starting to breathe again, you're not alone. Healing takes time, but clarity is the first step. What was the moment you finally knew it was time to let go? Drop it in the comments. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this helped you feel seen, stay close. There's more where this came from.